The UK Civil War, how it all went down. In 2025, the UK spiraled into chaos. Economic struggles, political division, and rising far-right nationalism led to a full-scale civil war that divided the nation. Protests, clashes, and brutal urban warfare tore through cities, as multiple factions fought for control. In this video, we'll explore how the UK fell into turmoil, the rise of extremist militias, and the brutal battles that shaped a fractured nation. From the birth of new factions to Scotland's independence and Ireland's military intervention, the landscape of the UK was forever changed. But how did it all come to a standstill, and who ultimately emerged victorious? Join us as we delve into the collapse of the United Kingdom and the aftermath of the UK Civil War. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction, based on an alternate history scenario. It does not reflect current political situations or real events in the UK. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals is purely coincidental. March 2025, the rising cost of living. The economic instability continues to worsen, triggering widespread protests across the UK. As inflation soars and unemployment reaches unprecedented levels, many working-class citizens find themselves unable to afford basic goods. The government's ineffectiveness in managing the crisis leads to greater discontent. In East London, particularly Tower Hamlets, the situation escalates. Leaders of the protest movements, including activists like Amira Hassan, a former social worker turned community leader, begin organizing protests at key sites like the Billingsgate Market in Canary Wharf, calling for immediate reforms. The protests spread across other boroughs, and by March, the government's attempts to suppress the protests with riot police escalate into violence. Clashes erupt in Hackney and Bethnal Green, with barricades being built and makeshift defense systems protecting areas from police incursions. Police Commissioner Victor Grange, once seen as a moderate figure, becomes a symbol of government oppression as his forces are ordered to quash dissent by any means necessary. His harsh tactics lead to significant casualties, particularly among immigrant communities in East London. May 2025, the far-right surged. The Britain First coalition, led by charismatic yet radical figures like Darren Carrington, a former military officer with extreme nationalist views, begins to gain traction. Carrington's speeches called for the expulsion of immigrants and the reinforcement of British heritage, invoking a return to a mythical version of the past. As the far-right gains power, their influence extends beyond politics. The nationalist militias, now forming paramilitary groups, start to secure territories in towns and cities like Kent, Sussex, and Essex. Carrington becomes a charismatic leader for this growing movement, speaking at rallies where his supporters clamor for military action against immigrants, left-wing activists, and protesters. In the streets of Brixton, a heavily multicultural area, the first major clashes occur between far-right militias and immigrant defense groups, including the Islamic Defense Front, IDF. The IDF, led by figures like Rashid Jamil, an ex-military strategist, fortifies East London with underground networks of resistance fighters, establishing the first organized urban guerrilla warfare operations. October 2025, the first clashes. By October, the nationalist regime's militia groups, now emboldened by their alliance with the police, start making significant territorial gains in southern London. Nationalist militias begin to encroach on East London, specifically areas like Tower Hamlets, Hackney, and Bethnal Green. These areas are fiercely defended by the IDF, whose leader Rashid Jamil becomes a symbol of resistance. The IDF focuses on disrupting key infrastructure, including water supply stations, power grids, and transportation hubs, to halt the nationalist regime's control over London. Meanwhile, the Black Liberation Junta, BLJ, led by Moses Okafor, a former political activist turned military leader, begins organizing in South London. Their forces launch coordinated attacks in areas like Brixton and Peckham, eventually securing South London and expanding into the surrounding suburbs. They form alliances with local black community leaders, using strong grassroots networks to galvanize support against the far right. As winter approaches, the violence becomes a daily occurrence. The nationalist regime's military is stretched thin, and though they control parts of southern England, the capital's control slips further from their grasp. December 2025, the birth of factions. The UK now stands deeply divided. In East London, the IDF continues to fortify key areas, especially Canary Wharf, which serves as a vital center for their financial operations. Rashid Jamil develops a strategy of using financial leverage to cripple the nationalist regime's ability to fund their military operations. In South London, the Black Liberation Junta, BLJ, consolidates power with an iron grip, controlling key neighborhoods like Brixton, Clapham, and Camberwell. Moses Okafor grows into a larger-than-life figure in these communities, his propaganda emphasizing the need for independence and freedom from the oppression of the far-right and government forces. The BLJ begins to push into Manchester, where their first significant engagement takes place in the working-class district of Encores. Their forces clash with far-right militias, resulting in the establishment of BLJ-controlled zones within the city. The nationalist regime begins to lose its foothold outside the south, unable to hold major cities like Manchester and Birmingham, where resistance movements led by local militia groups rise up in force. The British government turns to heavy fortifications, building walls around the cities they still control. February 2026, Scotland declares independent. Scotland, led by First Minister Angus MacDonald, seizes the opportunity of the UK's instability. MacDonald's Scottish Nationalist Party, SNP, which had long pushed for independence, calls for an immediate referendum, capitalising on the chaos south of the border. As Scottish forces take control of Edinburgh and Glasgow, the UK military, increasingly fragmented and divided by allegiances, is unable to mount a significant defence. The UK's loss of Scotland sends shockwaves through the rest of the country. NATO sends peacekeepers to stabilise the situation, with Edinburgh becoming the de facto capital of the new independent nation. Scottish forces fortify the border and work with NATO to ensure Scotland's sovereignty. March 2026, Ireland moves on Northern Ireland. Indiana, a swift and aggressive move. The Irish government, led by President Fiona McCarthy, launches a military operation into Northern Ireland, citing the need to protect the rights of Irish citizens living in the region. The Irish Army secures Belfast and Derry within weeks, facing only limited resistance from poorly equipped Loyalist militias. Loyalist leader Bobby Garrison, a former member of the Ulster Defence Association, tries to rally resistance in Londonderry but is soon overwhelmed. The Irish military moves swiftly to consolidate control, and by the end of March, the Irish Army has taken full control of Northern Ireland's key strategic positions. The reunification of Ireland becomes a reality as the Irish government asserts authority over Northern Ireland, while resistance from Loyalist groups collapses in the face of overwhelming force. April 2026, the government militarizes with the collapse of Scotland, Northern Ireland, and much of England. The nationalist regime declares martial law across England. The military, however, is no longer united. Factions begin to emerge within the armed forces, with some soldiers siding with the IDF or the BLJ, while others remain loyal to the regime. General Sir Edward Burke, once a high-ranking officer in the British Army, pledges loyalty to the nationalist regime, but his forces are under constant pressure from defectors and guerrilla movements. The government fortifies Westminster and surrounding areas, using the West End as their base of operations. The nationalist regime begins working to establish a defence perimeter around southern England, where nationalist militias have formed a semi-autonomous zone, turning Dover into a heavily fortified coastal stronghold. June 2026, NATO intervention. The intervention by NATO, led by General Robert White, comes after months of escalating violence and civilian suffering. NATO initially focuses on securing regions like Scotland and Northern Ireland, where they can provide humanitarian aid and stabilize the local governments. However, by mid-2026, NATO is forced to intervene more heavily in England, particularly in Birmingham and Manchester. NATO forces, with support from the United States, engage in their first full-scale urban combat in Birmingham, where the IDF and nationalist regime are engaged in intense street battles. NATO secures key areas of the city, establishing a fortified zone around Birmingham Central Station, allowing them to distribute humanitarian aid and provide medical support. The nationalist regime, in retreat, begins to consolidate power in Cornwall and Devon, while East London remains a flashpoint of resistance, where the IDF continues to fight tooth and nail against both government forces and nationalist militias. August 2026, the refugee crisis. The violence in the UK has now reached a level not seen since World War II. Millions of Britons and immigrants alike are fleeing the conflict, many trying to escape through the Eurotunnel to France or across the Channel via overcrowded boats. Nationalist militias focus on controlling key exit points, but their control is limited, and thousands of refugees are left stranded in the UK's coastal towns. The EU provides emergency support, but with limited resources, the situation grows worse. The refugee crisis becomes a top international issue, with neighbouring European countries grappling with the influx of people fleeing the violence. 2027, the long war. The war becomes a grinding conflict with no clear end in sight. The IDF holds East London and has managed to push into key Midlands territories, where they engage in guerrilla warfare with far-right militias. The BLJ secures large portions of South London and begins to extend their reach into Bristol and Manchester, while nationalist militias cling to their coastal strongholds. The nationalist regime is on its last legs, unable to hold major urban centres or maintain effective governance. The British government collapses under the weight of its internal divisions, and NATO continues to play a mediating role, although their presence is increasingly resented by factions on the ground. 2029, the end of the war, aftermath and fragile peace. By 2029, the UK has disintegrated into a fractured nation, its political landscape irreparably altered. The far-right nationalist regime, which came to power in late 2024, has been defeated and reduced to a series of scattered militias. The regime's hold on the country's military and police forces crumbled over the course of the Civil War, which left the UK deeply divided, with separate regions under the control of different factions. Territorial control. East London. The Islamic Defence Front, IDF, maintains control of East London, including critical infrastructure like power plants, water supply stations, and transportation hubs, including Canary Wharf, which holds significant strategic and financial value. The IDF's ability to disrupt London's financial activities and its stronghold in East London turned them into a key power player. Over the years, they've built extensive fortifications, turning neighbourhoods like Tower Hamlets, Waltham Forest, and Hackney into fortified zones, complete with civilian militias supporting their defence. South London. The Black Liberation Junta, BLJ, has consolidated its control over South London and is rapidly expanding its influence into the Midlands, particularly into Birmingham and parts of Manchester. The BLJ's stronghold in Brixton has become an iconic symbol of their resistance and power. They've set up their own governance structures, offering protection and resources to local communities, and have become increasingly skilled in guerrilla warfare. As a result, they are viewed as a key power broker in the country's future. The far-right nationalist regime's hold on rural England. While the nationalist regime collapsed in major urban centres, their militias continue to control several rural areas in southern and coastal England, including Cornwall, Devon, and parts of Kent. These areas are heavily fortified, with nationalist fighters securing the coastline to prevent NATO intervention. However, their power is no longer absolute, as insurgent groups, including those from the IDF and BLJ, continue to challenge their control. The nationalist regime has lost much of its organizational coherence, with militias splintering into smaller factions and waging increasingly futile guerrilla campaigns. Scotland. Scotland declared independence in February 2026 and swiftly became a new political entity. Edinburgh is the capital, and the Scottish forces, bolstered by support from NATO, were able to secure major cities like Glasgow and Aberdeen with little resistance. The Scottish independence movement is now firmly in control, and the country has begun rebuilding with European Union aid. Despite political and economic uncertainty, Scotland is quickly establishing its own identity, distancing itself from the chaos of the former UK. Ireland and Northern Ireland. Ireland's military intervention in Northern Ireland in March 2026 led to a swift and largely uncontested reunification. The Irish Army took control of Belfast and Derry, and within weeks, the Northern Ireland Loyalist militias were overwhelmed by the Irish military's superior resources and manpower. Reunification has not been without its challenges, as pockets of Loyalist resistance remain, particularly in rural areas of Northern Ireland. However, the Irish government has managed to stabilize the region, despite occasional clashes with remaining Loyalist militants. Northern coastal and countryside areas. The nationalist regime's control extends over small, isolated rural towns and coastal areas, especially in southern England, where the regime is attempting to regroup and secure strongholds along the English Channel and Dover. Nationalist militias have fortified coastal towns like Dover and Folkestone, attempting to hold on to strategic areas. However, their power is waning as NATO forces intervene to maintain order in certain regions, especially in Kent and Essex. The standstill, the battle for peace. The Civil War came to a standstill by the summer of 2029, following a year of intense urban warfare and strategic stalemates. The tipping point came when NATO peacekeeping forces began enforcing no-fly zones over critical urban centers, offering protection to civilians caught in the crossfire. As the nationalist regime's forces retreated to rural and coastal regions, NATO increased its military presence, providing humanitarian aid and attempting to mediate between the factions. By the fall of 2029, NATO-led peace talks began in earnest, with international pressure mounting to end the bloodshed. The nationalist regime, by this point exhausted and lacking resources, agreed to cease hostilities in exchange for certain guarantees regarding the rights of their remaining militia members and the preservation of rural territories under their control. However, no formal surrender was ever issued, and many former regime fighters simply melted into local militias, continuing their resistance from the shadows. Key political figures from the IDF and BLJ, supported by mediators from the European Union and NATO, were central to these talks. A fragile peace emerged from these negotiations, but the country remained deeply fractured. It became evident that the UK would not return to its former political structure. Instead, smaller, independent states and factions, many with limited resources, would have to navigate an uncertain future. The political landscape, a new beginning. The far-right nationalist regime's failure to secure widespread loyalty and political unity led to their collapse in 2029, following widespread desertion and infighting within their military ranks. With no clear successor to the regime, the far-right's hold over the country dissolved. Many of its leaders were either killed or forced into exile, while the surviving factions went underground or fled the country. The IDF and BLJ, however, were seen as the emerging powers. These groups now hold key positions in the interim government, though their goals remain deeply divergent. While the IDF focuses on the defense of Muslim communities and securing a strong foothold in the East, the BLJ has begun negotiating with European leaders for international support and recognition of their governance in South London and the Midlands. Amid this chaos, the international community has begun to broker peace talks. The European Union has promised economic aid for reconstruction, but political stability is a distant goal. The first parliamentary elections after the war. The first free elections in the new UK are scheduled for 2030, though their exact date will depend on how the situation evolves. The nationalist regime's influence is all but gone, but its supporters remain active in rural areas, where they continue to resist the new government. The far right has splintered into smaller, localized movements, though there is no cohesive national party representing their ideals. The BLJ and IDF, meanwhile, hold significant power in their respective regions and may seek to establish their own political systems. The election, if it goes ahead, will be fraught with tension, with the risk of violence and disruption high. The path to reconstruction. The challenges facing the UK in 2030 are monumental. The economic and political fabric of the nation has been shredded, and the path to a united, functioning government seems distant. While the IDF and BLJ have garnered popular support in certain regions, the future of the UK is uncertain, with former militias now regrouping and evolving into political factions. The war, though officially over, has left a legacy of scars that will take generations to heal. Communities have been displaced, urban centers are scarred, and the trust in the central government has been eroded. However, for the first time in years, a semblance of peace holds, and the British Isles begin the slow process of rebuilding, with external aid providing a lifeline for the fractured nation. New leaders will emerge, many from the ashes of the Civil War, and the future of the UK remains unknown, its story far from over.